In this speech, we'll prove to you that in the case the prosecution has presented to you today, there's insufficient proof to convict. We would ask for a verdict of not guilty. Jurors, we urge you to use your best judgment and to strip yourself of as much bias as possible. Please remember that if what we show you today causes you to have any reasonable doubt, that it is reason enough to acquit Mr. Asaro.
All right, let's begin. To start off, we're going to take a practical look at the case the prosecution has presented. In sum, they presented to you testimony from several witnesses, chiefly from Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro, who were two other mafiosi who turned on Mr. Asaro and reported his alleged crimes to the authorities. Now, right off the bat, does anyone find anything interesting in that? Anything missing? Right. So the entirety of the prosecution's case is based off the testimony of two criminals and nothing more. There are two huge problems here. First, there is not a shred of hard evidence here. The prosecution can't give you any forensic evidence regarding the murder of Paul Katz or the Lufthansa heist that links back to Vincent Asaro, nor can they give you any paper trail or written documentation that the defendant had any involvement. Now, doesn't it seem odd that in two major crimes, both of which are highly complex and will require maximum effort from the perpetrator, there is absolutely no hard evidence to point to Vincent Asaro, the man who the prosecution claims was the sole mastermind behind both? Jurors, that means that if you decide to convict Mr. Asaro, you are sending a man to jail based on the stories that two criminals came here to tell you. Explore your consciousness. Can you ruin a man's life based on solely hearsay? That brings us to the second problem. Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro are criminals in their own right. Among their crimes are theft and murder. Jurors, how can you find an ounce of credibility in the testimony of two despicable men devoid of any morals or decency?
To put it simply, you can't trust them. They do not care about the law or any social contract. Here's an example that makes it crystal clear what kind of men Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro are. The code of conduct in the Mafia is called omerta. To the Mafia, this code is sacred. As they don't pay much attention to the laws of the United States, omerta is their law, which every member is warned to never break. So what does omerta entail? It basically dictates that no member of the Mafia speak to law enforcement about the actions taken by the Mafia. And yet, here are Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro in court telling their truths to all who will listen. Now, while a defense, of course, does not agree with the concept of omerta, we think it's important to note this. Jurors, Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro have shown that they have no respect for expectations or for honor. They cannot even adhere to their own sacred code of laws. Do not let them fool you then into thinking that they have any respect for the law of the United States.
Now, jurors, we will show you explicitly why each of these witnesses would wish for Mr. Asaro to be convicted to serve their own agenda. We will start with Mr. Valenti. Mr. Valenti admits to knowing about the murder of Paul Katz and the Lufthansa heist. In respect to the Lufthansa heist, Mr. Valenti admits to being one of the people who actually committed the theft and then asserts that Mr. Asaro planned the heist but was actually waiting in a car several miles away while the heist occurred. In other words, he incriminates himself, but then attempts to blame his actions on Mr. Asaro without any actual evidence of Mr. Asaro's involvement. In respect to the murder of Paul Katz, Mr. Valenti claims that Mr. Asaro brought him the body and that he buried the body in the basement of a house that Mr. Valenti owned, and that Mr. Valenti then covered it with lime as to speed up the decomposition progress. Now, given that the only other witness who was present with Mr. Asaro at the time of the delivery is now deceased, it essentially becomes Mr. Valenti's word versus Mr. Asaro's. That is a key detail, jurors. Recognize that if you find Mr. Asaro guilty, Mr. Valenti transitions from dangerous criminal to mindless follower. If you acquit Mr. Asaro for utter lack of evidence, Mr. Valenti will have to be held accountable for his actions. Jurors, you can now see why Mr. Valenti would be in a much better position if Mr. Asaro is convicted. Let's explore this further.
As part of his deal, Mr. Valenti wore a wire when he was around his cousin, Mr. Asaro, for 5 years. He claims to have hoped that Mr. Asaro would say something to incriminate himself. However, in all that time, Mr. Asaro never once said anything that could merit conviction. That is bizarre, that in 5 years, this man, who the prosecution claims committed terrible crimes, never once said anything that could be incriminating, even around his close family. Could that be, jurors? That is because he had nothing to say about these crimes, because he wasn't involved in it at all. Mr. Valenti didn't wear this wire for free, however. In addition to the reduced sentence that Mr. Valenti received for testifying against Mr. Asaro, he was also being paid $3,000 a month to wear the wire. This is key evidence, as Mr. Valenti admits on the stand that at the time, he was in serious debt from gambling and owed thousands of dollars to several people. He also displays the characteristics of a gambling addict, as he continued to gamble even while being in serious debt. Now, despite revealing that he is a man with poor judgment and possible addiction issues, Mr. Valenti also reveals that he had incentive to tell the authorities that his cousin, Mr. Asaro, was a criminal, even if it were untrue, because he was receiving much needed financial compensation to do so.
Alright, now we move on to Mr. Zuccaro. He's been a key witness in this case, but we simply cannot believe him. Remember that this man is a gangster who has committed hundreds of crimes. He's admitted to dealing drugs, murder, robbery, you name it, he's done it. He murdered multiple men, including Johnny Gerbert and Settimo Flavia. This is a guy who was accustomed to breaking the law, thus we cannot listen to his testimony and take it into account when evaluating this trial. Zuccaro has said that he and the defendant don't see eye to eye, but this is an understatement. This man has clear motives to hurt the defendant. Ever since Zuccaro killed the defendant's dog, they have had an extremely rocky relationship. Mr. Asaro accused Zuccaro of doing heroin and got him in trouble. We see that these are two men who are out to get each other. Mr. Zuccaro will profit from the defendant's potential conviction, and this is why he gives us a false testimony. In the end, it is one man's word versus another. Do we really want to listen to a gangster who is happy to break the law, who will profit from Asaro's conviction, and who has had a rocky and cold past with Mr. Asaro? Jurors, given all that you now know about the prosecution's key witness, we believe that it is clear that the testimony of Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro should not be used in this case, at which point the prosecution has no evidence and no leg to stand on.
And further, jurors, we wanted to look at the root of the mafia, the place from which all this crime stems. Mafia culture emerged in America during the late 19th century, specifically in the Lower East Side of New York, which had a high concentration of immigrants. Sicilian immigrants who had come seeking the American dream found a harsh and cruel city that refused to embrace them and allow them to assimilate. Most importantly, they found that they were discriminated against at every turn and were forced to live in poverty. Thus, they turned to a practice that they had witnessed in their homeland, the formation of a society of organized crime that was then called Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing. For them, this was the only way to make money for their families and to survive in a violent and tumultuous city where no one was looking out for them. And the terrifying fact is that despite the fact that this ill treatment of immigrants happened centuries ago, the effects are still haunting America today. Mr. Asaro, Mr. Valenti, and Mr. Zuccaro are all men whose lives have been dominated by this world of crime because their ancestors faced anti-immigrant sentiment.
Although we do not excuse the blatant and admitted criminal offenses committed by Mr. Valenti and Mr. Zuccaro, the defense finds it lamentable that they are in this situation given that they never really had a chance to escape and find that American dream that their ancestors came looking for all those years ago. In the case of Mr. Asaro, we would find it a gross misuse of justice if Mr. Asaro were convicted of crimes of which there is no proof of his involvement, but simply because he is a part of a community that has lived in the shadows of America for decades, which is no fault of Mr. Asaro's. We would also like to point out that anti-immigration sentiment has far from disappeared from America, although it has shifted to primarily those who immigrate from the Middle East. We, the defense, hope that these undue allegations against Mr. Asaro and all the mafia crimes brought to light in this case will have an illuminating effect and demonstrate just how perilous xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment are to this nation as a whole.
Yet in the end, we have come here to discuss the involvement of Mr. Asaro in the murder of Paul Katz and the Lufthansa heist. Jurors, the prosecution has based its entire case on two witnesses, and we have shown why the testimony of those two criminals is worthless, as they serve only themselves and have no regard for justice or the law. They attempt to place the largest blame on Mr. Asaro, but the actual evidence, or rather, lack thereof, speaks for itself. There is cause for reasonable doubt and beyond. Plainly, there is no proof or evidence to suggest that Mr. Asaro committed these crimes. Thus, we ask you, jurors, for a verdict of not guilty.
Wait, what the?
Oh, yes. Jesus, everyone's ready.
You can do it under there.
Oh my God, go.
Let's go.
Go! It's raining so hard. What did you drop? I'm not waiting for you. Just go. To put it simply, you can't trust them. That's too sassy, I'm going. Let's do this. To put it simply, you can't trust them. I just realized I'm on my hair in front of me.
To put it simply, you can't trust them.
To put it
I can see it from the window, so.
Bye.
He's gonna beat you up with his vineyard vines t-shirt. 5 years.
He claims to have helped.
God damn it!
No, oh my god, wait. My friend's dad is in a Hillary Clinton video because Donald Trump fucked him over.
That's awesome.
Oh my god.
Wait, what?